learning and evolution.
Thanks, Natasha. So thanks for the invitation to speak here. So what I'm going to do is talk about the problem of language evolution. And in particular, I'm going to argue that there's a very strong and intimate relation between the problem of language change and evolution on the one hand, and the phenomena surrounding that, and the problems of language learning and acquisition on the other. And in fact, it's almost difficult to talk of one without the other. But this is, of course, not an entirely new argument. Linguists have known this for some time, though perhaps this particular interplay has been getting more concentrated attention only more recently. Now, my central thesis is actually that the nature of the interplay between learning by individuals and change in a population is very subtle. And it's very hard to reason about this interplay by verbal arguments alone. And to that end, what we will need to do is construct some sort of a computational or mathematical framework in which we can reason effectively about this interplay. So what I'm not presenting to you a single model, but rather a framework in which we will discuss a variety of models to understand the relationship between learning and evolution. So right now, I don't want to talk about evolution. Let me begin with acquisition, and let me begin with a fact. Okay. So here's a fact of English. I've put down two strings of English words, two sequences, and all of us who know English instinctively recognize that this is a well-formed expression, and this is an ill-formed expression. You could call it grammatical, you could call it acceptable, but it's well-formed and one is ill-formed. Now, we know this fact because we know English. And part of our knowledge of English seems to endow us with the ability to separate the well-formed expressions from the ill-formed expressions. But of course, we weren't born knowing English, right? So presumably, we learned this fact, and we learned facts like this from exposure to sentences of English, and in particular to the well-formed expressions of English. So language acquisition is this process by which we go from linguistic experience to linguistic knowledge. Now, if we accept that linguistic knowledge can be usefully represented by a computational system or a grammar, and if we accept that this map from experience to knowledge is algorithmic, then language acquisition will admit computational modes of inquiry into the process. And that has been more or less the point of view of linguistics, cognitive science, and artificial intelligence for some time now. And there has been more or less a well-established framework in which people reason about what is called the logical problem of language acquisition. Okay? So the framework looks like this. Script G is a class of possible grammars. One particular grammar is the target grammar, G of T. The learner is exposed to examples from this target grammar through a sequence of examples, S of n. So S of n is a collection of n examples. A is a learner, in the real world a child, in the artificial world any algorithm. And we would like to understand the universe of possible algorithms in some cases. And what A does is it maps the set of examples into some computational system or grammar and call Hn to be the grammar that this learner develops after being exposed to n example sentences. Okay? Now, this is really mimicking, in some sense, an idealization made a long time ago, and one that I want to drop a little later, but the idealization is, consider an ideal speaker-child interaction on a desert island, a parent-child interaction. So the parent is speaking a grammar G of T. The child is exposed to example sentences from the parent. The child develops the grammar H of n. And what we take to be the central dogma of language acquisition is, for every possible grammar that the parent could possibly be speaking, the child will develop a grammar which is very close to the parental grammar. Okay, that is the central dogma of language acquisition. If you're in Beijing, you will learn Chinese. If you're in Chicago, you will learn English. Okay?
Well, maybe.
That is the central dogma.
Or Polish or Spanish or whatever.
Right. Okay. So that therefore leads to this very important question which has been studied for a long time. the question of learnability. Is it the case that as n goes to infinity, Hn will converge to g of t for all possible g of t in the class script g? Okay, this question has received a lot of attention from mathematics, from statistics, because it's essentially a question of inference, from theoretical computer science, from logic, inductive inference, decision theory, and so on. There's an early sort of tradition based on recursion theory due to Gold in 1967. A more recent probabilistic version of that in learning theory is due to Les Valiant, where instead of asking whether Hn converges to g of t on all possible example sentences, you ask whether it converges probabilistically and with what rate and so on. So there's a lot of inquiry into this, and the long and short of all of this is that tabula rasa learning is not possible. That is, if the class of script G was completely unconstrained, it was a set of all RE sets, okay, formally, then it would not be a learnable family. So given this basic insight, my take on the field is that linguists try to basically say, what is the class of possible script of G's which can occur in nature, in humans, okay? So this is the class of possible natural language grammars that humans can invent, can speak, have spoken in the past, are likely to speak in the future, and try to give a description of this set, which we know to be a constrained set. And psychologists or developmental psychologists would like to give a description of this learning algorithm script A, which is the procedure by which children would construct a grammar from examples, and taken together, if the two are able to work in concert, and as you know from the history of the field, they don't always do, hopefully we will see a solution to the logical problem of language acquisition. Okay, so let me take the linguistic point of view for a moment. And with the realization that script G is a small set embedded in the set of all RE sets, linguists say, let us try to give a low-dimensional characterization of this family script G. And one approach has been, roughly speaking, coincides with what is called the principles and parameters approach, which says, I know script G is a small family, so let me try to give you a description of this small family in some parametric form. And so I will write down a parameterized class of grammar script G, parameterized by a finite number of parameters P1 through Pn. I set them to one set of values, I'll get the grammar of Swahili. I set them to another set of values, I'll get the grammar of English, and so on. And so my conception of language acquisition is almost as if the child came born with this family script G in its head, and all it had to do when it received data was estimate these parameters. So this is essentially a statistical parameter estimation problem with a parametric family, okay? But this is, of course, not the way it is presented in the linguistics setting. Now,
how is this different from Chomsky's universal grammar? Can you just say a little more about that? It seems to be very similar.
This is
Yeah.
what is called universal grammar in linguistics, the class script of G. Okay, so from the non-learnability ideas here, what we recognize is that the family of learnable grammars is going to be some small family. Now, the different linguistic theories, from West Coast linguistics to East Coast linguistics, from HPSD to GB to LFG to all these sorts of things, are different theories of script G. So they are all theories of universal grammar. So Chomsky has a very particular theory of universal grammar identified with GB at one point, and now minimalism and so on. But I don't want to make a commitment to that particular theory necessarily. I want to say principles and parameters is a slightly broader point of view, which says, let's consider the class of theories which can be parameterized. So for example, something which is clearly not identified with Chomsky is optimality theory. Okay? Optimality theory is a parametric theory. There are a set of n constraints, you re-rank them, and you get different grammars. Okay? And that is exactly consistent with principles and parameters, but due to the polemics of the field, which I don't want to discuss, it's somehow not identified with principles and parameters. Okay? So principles and parameters, in my view, are really all of these are in some sense principles and parameters theories. Okay? And in some sense, principles and parameters could be rationalized as a point of view on the following idea. If I give you a bunch of points in some space, what every statistician first wants to do is find out the principal components of this data set. What are the principal directions in which the data varies? So they try to give a low rank characterization of this set. That is exactly in some sense what the point of view of principles and parameters is. Here is a class script G. I'm going to try and give you some parametric description of this class and capture the principal dimensions along which the languages of the world vary from each other. So this is
just a point of clarification. It might help to say what is excluded by your characterization here. Any non-parameterized analysis.
I see this distinction as the distinction between parametric theory of statistics identified with Fisher and the non-parametric theory of statistical inference, which came later. Say Stone developed several results in the 60s. I see that the debate is somehow related to that, yeah.
Do you think, in your opinion, that any one person who can speak English can, through a computer, can output Chinese without human interpretation?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the question.
Do you think that a person can speak English or type in English into a computer and output Chinese without human interpretation?
Can a person type in English into the computer and the computer output Chinese translation of this English sentence?
An interpretation.
No. Well, if you were using this theory to build a machine translation system, that could be an interpretation. I think what you're asking is, suppose I get sentences in Chinese, I know the parameter setting for Chinese, I switch the parameter settings to get the grammar of English, can I then generate the translation of that sentence in English? And yes, there's a program which does that. It's called principle-based machine translation. Okay? But I don't, yeah. So this is really, in that sense, a much broader view, and in some sense all of linguistics. So this is somewhat abstract. So let me give you an example of actually what is a parameter, okay, in the real world, because what we want to do is real things. Okay, so an actual example of a parameter, for example, is X-bar theory. So if you look at a phrase of English, okay, here is a phrase, ran from there with his money. This is the phrase with which I began. And if you look at the parts of this sentence, you notice this has verb phrases like ran from there, and it has embedded in it prepositional phrases like from there and with his money. So there are two prepositional phrases, and English is prepositional. Okay, so the verb precedes the object, the preposition precedes its complement. So you say from there, over the table, under the chair, ran, and so on. And in contrast, Bengali, my native language, you would say or পয়সা নিয়ে সেখান থেকে দৌড়লো, his money with there from ran. You switch the parameters, it's post-positional, okay? And this is a well-formed expression in Bengali. And that's an example of a parametric dimension along which Bengali and English vary. And so the implicit model is that a child, if it's born in Calcutta, would receive example sentences from which they would figure out that the rules should all be left branching. And if they were born in Chicago, they would figure out the rules should all be right branching. Okay? Now, this particular fact is a fact. Now, you can give it a treatment in many different linguistic formalisms. And I don't want to commit to any one. Now, so in this view, then, language acquisition reduces to learning parameters. And there's a whole theory of learning around all of this. And the problem is this, that if the logical problem of language acquisition was solved perfectly, if children acquired perfectly the language of their parents, and if this went on generation after generation, then language would be transmitted perfectly from one generation to the next, and languages would not change except for major contact and migration and other effects of this sort. So you have to now think about the relationship of the logical problem of language acquisition to the seemingly illogical problem of language change. Okay? So if you start looking at English, you notice that English has changed. This is a somewhat ironic quote. So there are, of course, many changes in English, and now I'm going to show you some of them. Here is Old English from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles in about 900 AD. Okay, this is the original, and this is the word-for-word gloss. Okay, now this is what they were speaking. This is the language their children should have learnt, and their children and their children and their children. So how did it come to be that 1,000 years later the language has become so unrecognizable from the past, given that in every generation the children are solving the logical problem of language acquisition and presumably acquiring the target grammar that they have set out to turn. So we are given on the one hand the central dogma that language acquisition is robust, reliable, perfect, and so on, this great mystery. On the other hand, we have these deep problems of change. So now the issue is, many things have changed, but I want you to focus on word order, the same parameter that we discussed, okay? So here are some phrases, okay? There camped, gave the army him hostages, instead of gave the army gave him hostages. Their king baptism receive would. That's a well-formed expression. Instead of their king would receive baptism. And there's more. Then Darius saw that he conquered be would. Now I will also the great Alexander considering be. Okay? And then you have recursion, and it starts becoming incomprehensible. Dreading that the Lacedaemonians over them rule might as they before did. This, although not shall distrust, I never to God that he as not can shield. So it's very consistently post-positional. Okay? So if this parameter was once post-positional and children were trying to learn this parameter and their children after them and their children after them, then how did this parameter suddenly switch? That's the question. So clearly, learning and evolution are related, and in fact, people knew this a long time ago. Here's a quote from Henry Sweet, who was actually the British phonetician who was the model for Henry Higgins in My Fair Lady. Okay. So if languages were learned perfectly, then language would not change. So the fact that languages are changing means that languages are not learned perfectly. Yet we start with this assumption that they are learned perfectly. So there's some tension, yeah.
Are you going to talk about the fact that the poor children of England had to learn, like languages spoken by different people, like the French and the Danish and the Anglo-Saxons and all these different? I mean,
absolutely.
It's not just a matter of this thing wandering off, right? It's a matter of being different parents and people that you meet in the street who are all speaking different languages, and so it's not just that you can't pass with the gospel that's passed down to you, but there are several gospels being passed down to you, and you have to find compromise in between.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that's what I want to do, okay? What I want to say is that there are two separate issues that your question brings up, okay? First of all, one is, if you look at isolated, what I will call thermodynamically sealed communities, where there was originally one homogeneous language, sometimes you do find patterns of change in those languages too. Okay, so that's a phenomenon that we clearly have to explain. Okay, I'll leave that aside. Now come to English, since we're discussing English. Okay, here there was, in fact, the story that a linguist will tell you, and the story that everyone will tell you, is that there was actually language contact between a northern Scandinavian type, a southern Saxon type. The two came in contact. Children were receiving examples from these two grammars, and then they did something because they received these two grammars. Okay. So now that requires us to reformulate the structure of learning theory, which was inspired by a setting where there was a unique grammar, and the learner is trying to acquire this unique grammar. And in the real world, there is no unique grammar. Many people talk to you. You learn a language from multiple people. They may have different grammars. The data that you receive is possibly conflicting. And so we will have to develop a theory of learning in a population setting and explicitly. Okay? That's the central point of developing this new kind of learning theory in a population setting. So in fact, this is exactly what this slide is saying. So if you think about language change, when you say English has changed, you're making a statement about a group of people who lived in a well-defined area and their average linguistic behavior somehow. And so you have to deal with how does one model populations of linguistic agents and their interplay. Okay? And these are the kinds of questions that you want to think about. And these are the kinds of phenomena. Okay? In syntax, you have word order change. They're very striking. You know, most of us don't think about history very much. If you look at historical texts, it's actually mind-boggling how languages change. So syntactic change, and these are not nuances here and nuances there, new words because we have computers today and railways and things like that. These are deep structural changes. Stress, creoles, all these. Okay, so these are the phenomena. And then if you want to think about this not at a historical scale but on an evolutionary scale, questions like the origin of language, then these are the kinds of questions. Okay. But then, of course, you don't really have data coming from humans. What you probably want to do is look at variety of animal communication systems and do comparative studies and see how different communication systems might have emerged. So those are the questions. And before I get into any models, I just want to give you a sense of the timeline of inquiry. A lot of this started with the 18th century when William Jones, who was actually a British judge in my hometown in Calcutta, noticed that Sanskrit, Persian, Greek, Latin all seem to have a commonalities and formulated what he called the Indo-European thesis, which was actually a very radical thesis in a colonial setting. Okay? And Darwin was influenced by Jones, among other people, and he lived in 19th century and of course suggested humans and primates and all of these might have a common origin, which was also a very radical thesis. And then things have happened in the 20th century. But if you go and look at the writings in the 19th century, you see a lot of interplay between language, people writing about the evolution of language and trees and so on, and biology. And so, if you want to think about biological evolution and you want to think about linguistic evolution, what's the difference? In biological evolution, you're studying, say, the genetic variation in adults. Genetic variation is transmitted via inheritance. Natural selection sometimes acts on the phenotypic space if it's not a neutral. And then you have genetic variation in children. In language evolution, you're studying grammatical variation in the adult population. This is transmitted to the next generation, but the mechanism of transmission is inheritance. It is learning, not inheritance. You don't inherit your parents' language. You have to learn it. So learning will play a very central role. The other thing is that every agent has many linguistic parents, not just one linguistic parent. Okay, so this Tom Griffiths talked yesterday about one particular kind of interplay between learning and evolution, where you learn from one person. One of the things is that when you look at these models, based on whether you learn from one person or you learn from many people, you can get very, very different evolutionary consequences. In one case, you'll get linear dynamics, like we saw yesterday. In the other case, you'll get nonlinear dynamics. So these are what we learn. So I've been doing this for a long time, actually, for almost 10 years. And this is what I have learned from this whole inquiry into trying to understand the relation between learning. So different learning algorithms can have different evolutionary consequences. And therefore, it may allow us to invoke evolutionary criteria in addition to learnability criteria to distinguish between two learning algorithms. So in addition to bringing developmental data on the table to ask whether learning theory is adequate, you can bring historical data to the table. The next thing, which was really not obvious at all to people until a model is built, is that you can actually get bifurcations in the dynamics. That the dynamics of evolution of a population is nonlinear, that there could be bifurcations and some parameters could change continuously, leading to a dramatic pattern of the stability profile of a language. And we'll see how that is applicable to the English case. And then another kind of question, I don't know if I'll have time for it, is the following sort. How do a group of people arrive at a shared communication system without a centralized agency enforcing uniformity? Okay, can through local interaction and learning from each other, a group of people arrive at a common word for a particular concept, say, okay, and things of that sort. All right, so I try to give you a sense of the program, of what are the phenomena, what are the questions, why it's interesting or why it's important even. And here's the basic framework. So you have a class, scriptel, L1 through Ln are n possible linguistic types, okay? X1 through Xn are going to be n positive numbers summing to 1, which is going to be the proportion of each of these linguistic types in the population at any point in time. Okay? P1 through Pn are probability distributions with which speakers of these languages will produce example sentences for learners in the population. Okay? So think of L1. So here you have sigma star, which is the set of all possible sequences. Every language L is a proper subset of sigma star, which is the set of well-formed expressions. And think of P1 as a probability distribution on L1, which is the probability with which you produce every sentence. Because although there are infinitely many well-formed expressions in your language, you're not going to produce all of them with equal probability. Okay? So these are the probabilities with which you will produce each of these expressions. A is going to be a learning algorithm, which is going to be a map from data to L. That means if you're a learner, you'll receive data and you'll map it to some element of L1. So this will be the learner language that you'll acquire. K is maturation time. That means after K sentences have been received, whatever language you have, whatever language you've developed, you will stick with for the rest of your life. You will not forever wander around trying to, yeah.
What's an example of L1 or LN? What's an example of a member of the set script L?
Yeah. So you could say, in the case of English, the story that is told is that there were two grammatical variants that were competing in a population which differed by one parameter. Okay? I'll give you an example. So here is the set of all.
Use a darker.
Use another pen that works.
That's nice.
Yeah, this is good. So here is the set L1. Here is the set L2. These are the sentences of grammatical variant 1. These are the sentences of grammatical variant 2. I'll give you an example.
So they're sets of sentences?
Yes. They're sets of sentences.
But it's represented at like Old Norse versus Anglo-Saxon as opposed to your English versus his English versus my English versus, it's not like every individual has their own.
Actually, it is actually every individual has their own language, but then it becomes such a high-dimensional space that analysis is difficult. So what we do is the following, that if your English and his English do not vary on the parameter of interest, then we collapse those two Englishes and say it's the same English. Okay? So since we are looking at one parameter of interest, okay. So once we do this, that will allow us to derive a dynamics on the simplex. And that's the dynamics that we will study. Okay? So the simplest class of models, this is like...
What were the deltas?
This is just the simplex, actually. So I should just say, this is just, by that I mean, the set of all x1 through xn, which are positive numbers such that summation xi equal to 1. That's all. It's the proportion of each of the types in the language. Yeah, yes, well. Okay. Okay, so the simplest family of models are what are called the two-language models, and these are surprisingly effective. Okay, and the two-language model is like in population genetics. When I first picked up a textbook, I knew nothing about it, and then I talked to a friend, and he said you should read this book on population genetics. And the first thing you read is the one gene, two allele, infinite population, random mating, Hardy-Weinberg law, and in 3 pages you get some insight. Okay, so this is the equivalent of the one gene, two allele, infinite population. This is the one parameter, two languages model. So there are two languages, L1 and L2. This is like one variant of English. This is like another variant of English. If you look at English and German, okay, then you can actually see a parametric difference. So you have sentences, simple sentences like Hans buys the book is Hans kauft das Buch in German, which is subject, verb, object. But if you have if you complementize it, I know that Hans buys the book. then it becomes, I know that Hans the book bought. Okay? So it's so there are sentences which are parsable in grammar but not in English, and vice versa, and there are sentences which have parsable by both. So that's L, okay? L1 and L2. P1 and P2 are the probability distributions with which speakers of, say, English will produce expressions in this set. So this is P1 and this is P2, okay? And for our purposes, the only thing that will matter are two parameters, little a and little b. So little a is the probability with which speakers of L1 will produce expressions in the red region. And little b is the probability with which speakers of L2 will produce expressions in the red region. Yeah. And remember, the red region are sentences which, if a child receives, the child will not know what the underlying parameter is. So they are actually ambiguous sentences. Yeah.
When you talk about probability that people will produce a given sentence, is that sort of holding communicative intentions constant, or, I mean, is this a theory not only of how you speak, but anything that anybody would ever want to say?
Are you saying that, if I understand you...
What is the sample space of this probability distribution?
Well, the support of the probability distribution is this set. Okay, this set has elements. Every element is a particular sentence.
Okay.
So I'm just asking, what is the probability with which you will produce each of the sentences?
Integrating overall communicative intent.
Listen,
Yeah, either averaging over them, or I'm not. Yeah,
well,
I'm not sure what communicative intent.
well, there's a different probability, I suspect, that I will produce a sentence, I ate a hamburger and I ate a whale. And I ate a whale is perfectly good English grammar, but it's very unlikely ever to be said. That's the problem. So when you talk about a probability, do you mean the probability that a token will be produced in some, time and space?
I understand your question. Yeah, I understand your question, and it depends upon the application that you will have to define this. In this particular English application, the probability is over all linguistic structures. So I ate a whale and I ate a hamburger correspond to the same structure, which is noun, verb, noun, and the verb is takes one object. So I'm looking at probabilities over structures rather than actual sentences. In some other applications, you may want to look at probabilities over actual words too. So it depends on the application.
Not to belabor the point, but you could probably get a difference in token frequencies of different structures, like active sentences are probably more frequently spoken than passive sentences, and much more frequently spoken than middle sentences.
Yeah, that's true. I agree with that.
And so you would then give these different structures different probabilities.
Yes, absolutely.
So they are actually probabilities of tokens.
Yes, absolutely. So for example, as one example to consider here, the simple sentences and the complex embedded sentences are two types of sentences which will have different probabilities of being uttered to a child. When you talk to a child, it's unlikely that you have highly recursed, highly complex embedded sentences. Okay? So yes, that is in fact exactly what this probability distribution is trying to characterize.
But if somebody has a child, they're less likely to produce those complex sentences, and someone else doesn't have a child, so they probably speak in more, longer sentences. So this will depend on
The
other
person.
things like lifestyle and.
Yes. So actually every speaker should have their own probability distribution P2. That makes the analysis more complex, but then what happens is that you get a mixture of these, and it turns out that P1 and P2 could be the average probability distribution averaged over the whole population. Okay?
Of course, there are huge, verb-specific effects on structure too, right? So we use datives with some verbs and not others.
Right.
So
Right.
you're just averaging over all of that as well.
No, not necessarily. It depends on what you what your application is. I mean, right now the model is very abstract, right? When you start looking at actual data, you'll have to instantiate what are the elements of the set and make an equivalence class over structures based on your application. I just want to give you what we learn from studying this model first, okay? So now I want to look at, under this setting, look at just a few different learning algorithms, okay? Here is one learning algorithm. A learning algorithm says, start with an arbitrary hypothesis, receive an example sentence. If your hypothesis can parse this sentence, stick with it. If it cannot, change your hypothesis. So it's like a local, online gradient ascent kind of an algorithm, okay? In this case, since there are only two hypotheses that the child has, it just means switch your hypothesis. Now let's derive the dynamics, okay? So consider a typical child embedded in a heterogeneous population in which a proportion x of t speaks the language L1 and a proportion 1 minus x of t speaks the language L2. Then the probability distribution with which the child is exposed to sentences has this form, xtp1 plus 1 minus xtp2. It's a mixture of two distributions. That is the probability with which example sentences are given to this learner, and you're asking the question, what is the probability that the learner, after receiving k examples, will be at a state L1? What is the probability with which the learner will acquire L1 if it were given k example sentences drawn IID from this mixture of probability distributions?
The child is equally likely to meet anybody in the population.
Yes. So the equivalent of random mating. So it's a perfectly mixed population. There's no segregation of the two languages. Okay?
And no parents, so to say.
No parents. That is, parents don't have any particular influence on the children. Everyone in the population has influence on the children. So it's basically like a self-averaged population. Is that in every local neighborhood, you get the same distribution. So if you look at this, you'll get some function. Okay? This will be a function of x of t, little a, and little b. And this is the probability with which the typical child will learn L1 if immersed in a heterogeneous population in which a proportion x of t speaks L1 and a proportion 1 minus x of t speaks L2. And so if this is the probability with which a typical child will learn L1, this is the proportion of L1 speakers we should find in the next generation. This is the infinite population assumption. So infinite population, random mixing. That gives us the dynamics. X of t plus 1 is equal to f of x of t, a and b. So this is the basic logic. So you can apply this basic logic under any assumption you want about script G, about these P1, P2, and so on. So we can actually calculate this quantity, okay, because the learning algorithm is simple, and it turns out it looks like this. This n should be a k, actually. So you get an iterated map, x of t is evolving with time, and it is actually a polynomial map. This is k, and a and b are linear functions of x of t. So you get a polynomial map, okay, from the interval to itself.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Where's x of t? Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I see.
Capital A and capital B are linear
I see.
functions. Yeah. So this is a k plus 1 polynomial. This is a degree 1 polynomial. It turns out this actually exactly factors that, and you get a degree k map.
So it's,
You're going to show some graphs of this evolutionary?
it's essentially
I'll in fact
logistic
prove
map.
something. I'm not going to do anything by simulation.
It's a version of the logistic map, is what it is.
No, the logistic map would be k equal to 2.
Well, yeah, I know, but what you do is it's squared term, that x of t plus the constants multiples of x of t squared. So it's a quadratic map.
No, it's not quadratic. This is of order.
Oh, I forgot the,
Yeah.
You're right.
It's a degree k polynomial map. Yeah.
You're right.
Right? So it's a So exactly. So it could, in principle, have k roots and k fixed points and so on. It turns out it actually has exactly 2 roots in the interval 0, 1. And in fact, the easiest way to analyze this map is by letting k go to infinity, and you get this map. and this behavior is qualitatively like this behavior. So let's just look at this map instead. This is the map, and it's very easy to show here that little a is equal to little b would actually give you the identity. Okay, so you would see no change. If little a is less than little b, xt would go to 1, and if this was true, xt would go to 0. So there are always two fixed points, 0 and 1. Okay, and which one is stable depends on whether a is less than b or a is greater than b. Okay, so although this is a polynomial of arbitrary degree, it somehow has only two fixed points in the interval 0, 1. And so the dynamics is a lot simpler than you might imagine. So what it says is that you will get homogeneous populations, and if A is less than B, one of the types will be stable, and if A just drifts across, the other type will become stable. Okay, so let's just see this. If you start with a population where 0.99 of the population speaks X, okay, and so it speaks L1, 0.0001 speaks L2, so a majority of the population speaks L1, and I've sneakily chosen little a and little b to be like this. Okay, so children are immersed in this population in which a majority of the people are speaking L1. Okay, it's a heterogeneous population. So in the experience of the typical child immersed in this population where a majority speaks L1, there are obviously overwhelmingly many triggers for L1. Most of the sentences that the child encounters are produced by L1 speakers. In fact, if you do the calculation, you'll find that there are 88% sentences in the experience of a typical child that will have a unique L1 parse. And there are less than 1% of sentences in the experience of a typical child that will have a unique L2 parse. So in the experience of the typical child, there are overwhelmingly many L1 sentences being heard. And of course, what is the child going to do? With high probability, the child will acquire L1. Okay? So if you took a snapshot at that point in time, things would look great. 99% of the people are speaking L1. You know, there's a large number of L1 sentences. A child born in this population is going to acquire with high probability L1. Yet, actually, L1 is unstable. And so over a period of time, it will be lost. So what could be thriving can be lost because of just a drift of little a and little b. But little a and little b are what? They are the probabilities with which speakers are producing these ambiguous expressions. Okay, and that is a social fact. The probability with which you produce expressions depends upon so many circumstances that it could drift around due to contingency effects, which has nothing to do with language, but has everything to do with the nature of the world in which we live. And so a completely contingent drift of frequencies could lead to a dramatic breakdown in what is stable in a language.
One quick question. So for little a and little b, is it also true that that probability is determined by the child's interpretive bias? Because it's not just the probability of the speaker producing an ambiguous utterance, it's the probability of the child interpreting that utterance as ambiguous. Is that true? Because you have the fact that the child's going to be learning, so if they view it as ambiguous.
Yes, yes, yes. So I'm saying here I'm assuming that the child learner is not biased between L1 and L2. Okay? So that means if they receive an ambiguous sentence, then both L1 and L2 are consistent with this and the child doesn't know what to do. Okay? We'll later look at a situation where the child may have a bias. And then we'll see another interesting dynamics. Okay? And that's in the next one. Okay? So these are the Q-based models. So the Q-based models are the same setting, but a different learning algorithm. A learning algorithm in which the learner is biased to choose one language rather than the other in a certain sense. So you have a set of Qs which belong to the set difference of L1 and L2. So these are triggers. If I receive elements of C, I know that they have been produced by an L1 speaker. Okay? and little p is the probability with which these sentences are produced by L1 speakers. And this is what the algorithm does. It receives n example sentences, it counts the number of queues. If the number of queues is greater than some threshold tau, I choose L1, otherwise I choose L2. So my default is to go with L2 unless I receive enough queues that tell me I should go with L1. So in a lot of settings, like if you're learning the distinction between per and bur, or ter and der, in lots of situations of phonetic learning, it's often the case that there is an asymmetric queue. And your default would be to learn one unless you hear enough cues to the contrary. But anyway, so you can do this. So the situation is you again have a mixture of two language types, L1 and L2, a proportion x, 1 minus x, and a child immersed in this heterogeneous population where it's getting data from both sources and using an algorithm like this. And now you ask, what would the dynamics of this be? So it's interesting. This dynamics is also a polynomial map, just like the previous one. Okay? And what is interesting if you analyze this is that it leads to a bifurcation diagram that looks like this. So there is only one parameter, p, right, which is the probability with which people will produce queues. So for every value of p, you have this polynomial map. It turns out, again, the polynomial map has only possibly 3 roots in the interval 0, 1. Okay, but it has a bifurcation that looks like this, where if p is greater than a critical point p star, there are 2 possible stable states and 1 unstable state, and less than p star, there is only 1 stable state, which is 0. Okay, so what that means is that there is a regime in which L1 speakers are stable and L2 speakers are stable. Okay, and they will remain stable. And then there is a regime in which only L1 speakers are stable. Okay, so if you had a community speaking L2 sitting here, okay, and P drifted just a little bit across this threshold, you would fall down the cliff, and immediately L2 becomes unstable and L1 becomes stable. So this is sort of an explanation for how dramatic patterns of change could happen. So Lisa, who's here, actually looked at, in her thesis, at the Penn-Helsinki corpus, which is a corpus of sentences from Old English. And you can look at this. You can look at the OV, VO type sentences, and you can count essentially all the different types in these sentences over time. So you look at 1080. You just take a snapshot in time of 1080, and you see here's a proportion of people speaking L1, here's a proportion of people speaking L2. But of course, from that, you don't know what's going to happen in the future because you just have looked at one point in time. And you estimate little a and little b from that data set, from that point in time. And that will allow you to predict whether xt is going to increase or decrease at the next point in time. Okay? And so you can predict from one snapshot what is going to happen in the future, and then you can match it against what did happen in the future from the data. And so that's the sense in which you would actually see if the prediction you're making is consistent with the historically observed trends.
So how do you estimate little a and little b? You look at the proportion of sentences which are ambiguous?
Yeah, it's actually subtle because there are, yeah. You look at proportion of sentences which are ambiguous.
But they have to be produced by the author who speaks one or the other language.
Yeah. So actually, the model is a little more complex than I described it. Each speaker has a parameter lambda, which is the probability with which they will speak G1 or G2. So every person has his own lambda value. You have to estimate lambda and then A and B simultaneously.
I see.
So it's actually an involved process, which I've just...
But you can do it from the text.
Yes, you can do it from the texts. Okay. So you can do this. 2 forms in competition actually occurs in a lot of linguistic settings, in phonological mergers, okay, in vowel features, in stress systems, in loss of what is called verb second movement, in loss of null subjects. Lots of cases in English you find in the world, you find actually just one parameter has changed, voicing things which were voiced got devoiced, things, things like that. I'll give you an example which I've been looking at for a while with the student Morgan Sonderegger, which is change in stress patterns. So here's the example. Okay, this is real data taken from 1700 to 2000. Okay, and this is the following side of data. You look at 2-syllable words like combat, where each word has a noun form and a verb form. So there's combat, the noun, and combat, the verb. And you have research versus research, and abstract versus abstract, and so on, okay? So the stress could be on the first syllable, or it could be on the second syllable. This is the noun form, and this is the verb form, okay? And from dictionaries existing from 1690 or so, you can count what is the proportion of times it was used in one form versus the other. This is the time series that you get. So you see at one point, everyone said combat, okay, for both forms, the noun form and the verb form. And then suddenly at one point in time, over a period of roughly 25 to 50 years, 1 or 2 generations, the entire group moved to a second form, which is combat. Okay, and this is the modern form, combat, combat, whereas they were both pronounced combat at one point. And there's lots of data like this for lots of examples.
But that whole parameter didn't switch all at once for every word. That change traveled from word to word throughout the vocabulary. So the
Just, like the rate of change in other bisyllables.
Yeah, I have the data on the change across the whole vocabulary. I just showed you one example.
okay.
Yeah, so for every single, so there's a list of 2,000 words. They all have different rates. They are also linked into classes. You may say the COM class, all words which have the same first syllable. And so you can do the analysis by various, like clustering in various ways. But this is just another example to show you how so dramatically and suddenly a word can change its pronunciation. That's what I mean by the bifurcation phenomenon.
To follow up that, are you treating these as related? The different words like combat, research, or all the complex? Are you viewing each one as a separate phenomenon?
Right. So there are.
Together, are you doing both? I'm just trying to get a sense.
Yeah, I'm doing everything. Okay. That is to say, at one end of the scale is every word has its own history. At the other end of the scale is all words are lumped into one class. There's just one class, the disyllabic words. And in between are all the cases where there are subgroups which have their own history, and then there could be linkage between subgroups. So the point I'm trying to make is there is no one model that I want to present. Rather, I want to present some key ideas that run across all models. And the one key idea that runs across all models is, again and again, you make up these dynamical systems, you'll see it's nonlinear. You'll see there are phase transitions that can happen, bifurcations that can happen, and the parameters that are related to these bifurcations are naturally related to the frequency with which things are produced. And so a frequency effect, just the frequency with which you say something, could have a dramatic effect on the structural stability of a grammatical system. This is something this is all done in a very traditional Chomskyan tradition, right? If you look at this one parameter, two variance is very Chomskyan in this particular sense, though it doesn't have to be, okay? And even in that, you get these bifurcation drifts which are related to frequency. Okay, this is something which is not obvious at all. I have maybe 5 minutes, right? So I'll just tell you maybe one thing, which is kind of cute before. So this question that I've been looking at is the question of why do languages change with time, and what might be the forces that lead to languages changing with time. And I try to give you some sense of what kinds of models you would construct to reason about it, and what kinds of data you would invoke to test these models. Okay. Now I want to look at a different kind of a question, which is the following kind of question. You have a group of agents, linguistic agents, living in a society, communicating with each other, and how might a shared communication system emerge in a population of interacting agents without a centralized agency enforcing uniformity? Now, this kind of a question arises in many fields. Okay? It has its own form in each of those fields, and it has some common elements across these fields. So I'll talk about how can a group of people converge to the same word. Okay? So you're imagining a group of robots or a group of humans or a group of distributed agents living connected together by a social network, and they want to make up a word for, say, a dog. And so I make up the word dog, somebody else makes up the word kukur, somebody else calls it kutta, somebody else calls it something else. So here are a set of phonological forms, W, and everyone has an initial belief, which is a probability distribution over W, which is the probability with which they will use any of these words to refer to a dog. Okay? So the word that is produced will be a random variable distributed according to its belief. So it will be 0, 0, and 1 for the ith word, okay, which is if you produce the ith word. Okay? Now, these agents live on a social network. So you have many agents connected by a social network, and Bi of t is the belief of the ith agent at time t, and Xi of t is the word that the ith agent produces at time t to describe the word, which is a random variable distributed according to the beliefs. Now, the interesting thing is these agents are going to update their beliefs. They cannot see the whole population, they can only sample their neighbors. That's point one. Point two is they cannot see the private beliefs of the neighbors, that's hidden from them. All they can observe are the words that the person produced, which are random samples from the belief. So there are two hurdles to getting uniformity. So here's how the agent updates its belief. Okay? So its belief at time t plus 1 is its belief at time t plus this, which is the sum of all the words it heard at time t from its neighbors. So D is the degree of the, so you know how many neighbors I have.
Is B a vector?
B is actually, B is, in the case of n words, it is a vector, which is the probability with which I will.
You add the scalar to the vector.
Yes, so that's why I actually represented the words. Xj of t is represented as okay. So actually it's more than that. In general it will work for measures. D of j will be a measure and xj will be a random measure, which is the word I produce. Okay, so now the question is, what is this? This is actually updating. So now the B's have become random, right? Because initially I start off with a distribution of beliefs. Now the beliefs are getting updated by these random variables that are produced by the agent, so the beliefs have become random. So this whole thing has become a Markov chain, but it's a Markov chain not on a finite state space at all. It's a Markov chain on this, right? I have k agents, okay? And so this B1, B2, up to bk is the state at any time, and each bi is an element of this when there are n possible words. So it's a Markov chain on this cross product of n states. So what happens? Here are what you can prove. So with probability 1, as time goes to infinity, all beliefs become the same. Okay? Eventually everyone has the same belief. Furthermore, everyone converges to the corner of the simplex, which means that everyone not only has the same belief, this belief is a point measure. That means everyone ends up with the same unique word for that object. Because everyone could come up with the same probability distribution over possible words for the object.
But you're not saying which one.
Yeah, I'm not saying which one. There are actually n different
How can
words.
we get this without any reward or fitness?
Yeah, you get no. Yeah, that's the point. It's an important point. Exactly. There's no fitness. Everyone converges to the corner of the simplex. The rate will depend upon the Fiedler number of this graph, which is the second eigenvalue of the Laplacian of this graph. Okay, and the rate is independent. This is actually what was most striking to us of n. N is the size of the simplex. That is to say that it doesn't matter. You may think intuitively that if there are only two words, everyone says dog or cuckoo, okay, that you will converge faster to a shared word than if there are a million words and some people are saying dog 1, some people are saying dog 2, some people are saying dog 3, and so on up to dog million. Okay, and you would imagine that it would take longer for this population to converge to a shared word. In fact, that's not true. The rate is independent of n. So it doesn't matter if there are a million words at the beginning of time or just 1, 2 words at the beginning of time. You get a rate that depends only on the connectivity of the graph.
Does rate translate to time it takes?
Yes, that is exactly what it is.
Actual time it takes. So there's a million words, each with probability 1 over 1 million plus one word has epsilon edge or something versus there's 2 words with probability, I don't know.
Yeah, so every person.
Wait a minute. You said time, but by your model it's interactions because you have t plus 1, so it's interactions rather than time. So it can probably be roughly correlated with time, but it's more interaction according to the model that you had earlier.
When you say interactions, you mean that every exchange of neighbors? Yeah. Actually, the thing is that I'm looking at the Markov chain on this, looking at time.
I know what you're
So
doing,
now
but
there
I'm
is.
saying that the model is and that it's roughly correlated to time. And answer Jay's question, it's roughly correlated to, watch time, but it's really it's interactions that it's according to the model that you said. But it doesn't matter. It's
Yeah.
one.
Yeah.
But why is it only roughly? I mean, if you're assuming
Well,
there's one interaction per
if you're on a desert
one.
island or something like that, or versus a large city.
Oh, I see.
Well, that's going to.
Oh, yeah. You mean actual physical time? Yeah. It's interactions. I didn't understand your point. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Absolutely. It's not physical time.
No,
It's
I understand.
that. I think you
I
understand.
have a problem with
Yeah.
that, but,
Yeah.
So I just, rate could be the same for two things, but if you're starting farther away, you get to the target at a different time. Just making sure that the initial distribution is, in some sense, the initial distribution is farther from one of the corners if it's got many non-zero quantities.
Exactly. So right.
So if we drew a slope in some sense, it would actually have to be steeper in order to get to the corner at the same time.
Right.
So that's why maybe rate is even faster, inversely proportional to n.
Okay. So when I say rate, I mean the number of interactions t, such that this quantity is less than epsilon.
Okay.
Formally, that's what the rate is. Okay. Maybe I'll
The
just.
interaction time tells you something also in terms that you should expect that changes faster in cities than in back in the countryside.
Absolutely. So the rate does depend upon the connectivity of the graph.
Yeah, and what it does is it really, you have in other words, you have extra results that you can extract from it.
Absolutely. So you look at the connectivity pattern of the graph. For example, the graph has two connected components. You might get a different convergence in one component, a different convergence in another, and that is more or less like speciation, I think. Yeah.
Back when you showed the example of how combat had the phase transition into a different stress contour, it seemed to be right around the time that the printing press became widely used, I guess early 1700s. You think that maybe this technology changed how the social graph functioned, and maybe that's why they were able, like you had these phase transitions at that time.
Yeah.
And I guess that wasn't
Yeah.
the only word. You said they're like 2,000 words.
Yeah.
Does a preponderance of them change in that time period?
I haven't
Or
looked at
is
that.
the change of those
No.
verbs evenly distributed over the history that
It's not tightly concentrated at that time for sure, but I don't know, it's not uniformly distributed either on the other hand. So I have to look and see. Yeah, I just want to finish because I don't want to say anything more. I'm out of time. So I just want to conclude with these are what I've learned. One of the things that I should say here is when a group of agents arrive at a shared language, Natasha and I worked for many years on emergence of a shared language, and we needed to have fitness in those models to get a shared language. In this case, without fitness, a shared language emerges. Okay? Why? It's actually because of social connectivity. Okay? Those models were done essentially where every agent learned from another agent, and Qij was the probability with which you would end up with grammar J if you learned it from grammar I. Here, you learn from multiple people, so there is a chance that somehow there's a diffusion of a concept across the population. And so one thing that I feel is true is that if learning takes place in a nesting phase, so to speak, that you actually learn only from your parents, from one individual, and it has happened in some species of animals, like some songbirds learn in a nesting phase, then I think fitness is necessary to invoke uniformity. But if learning happens in a social setting, okay, then even without fitness, you may actually get uniformity if you learn in a social setting. So that's one sort of high-level point. So I think those are sort of the rough ideas that have emerged. You know, the fact that you can get bifurcations, the fact that different learning algorithms could have different evolutionary consequences, and the fact that different conditions for coherence could be expressed in terms of fitness or in terms of social connectivity. And these are all related in trying to actually get away from a certain idealization made in linguistics, which is we should try to study the ideal speaker-hearer in a homogeneous population. And now we want to say that program gave us some insights about the structure of language. Now we want to engage with the fact that in reality we are always immersed in a heterogeneous population, and now we have to construct our models in this population setting. It is something which biology took very seriously starting from Darwin, but linguistics probably only recently, although they said these things even before Darwin. Yeah, so that's
Like 3 minutes for questions.
So I found myself resisting certain elements of your talk, but I just want to say that I appreciate the goals very much, and I just want to ask, and indeed the insights. You know, I think it's really interesting work. But at the same time, I feel like I guess I wonder whether there's any reason why similar effects would or wouldn't occur if you liberalized your way of thinking about grammars considerably. So, for example, one could imagine that the state of an individual's language knowledge wasn't really binary with respect to any of these parameters, right?
You can answer the question.
In fact, that it was much more like
gradient.
And it was emergent of the specific variations associated with all the individual lexical items, such as the different verbs, you know, taking different kinds of constructions with different frequencies. And so you can write down a number which is in 70% of the time you produce the dative, and only 30% of the time you produce the to form. In reality, it's like, you know, many verbs are producing the data all the time, and so on. And so does anything at all change if you operate in a completely continuous space?
No, I think I agree with you that, in fact, I perhaps emphasize the discrete setting for clarity, but actually, for example, even in the discrete setting, things are not really discrete in at least 2 ways. So if you have 2 grammars, G1 and G2, it is never the case that an individual is either a uniquely G1 speaker or a uniquely G2 speaker. people are using a mixture of two grammars all the time. So sometimes they're producing sentences with a grammar type G, sometimes with a grammar type G2. So the actual grammar of an individual is not discrete, rather it is a point in the convex combination of two discrete elements. So it is like if you look at, some people say tomato, some people say tomato. There are two discrete elements, but you can think of a probability distribution with support on these two discrete elements, which is characterizing the actual behavior of a grammar. Okay? And actually the results are true for that continuous setting.
Okay.
And what you are saying
Makes
is
sense that they should be, right.
yeah, there are often technical difficulties that one has to overcome, because things sometimes may be harder to prove. In general, the whole point of view was to say I would like to construct models about which I can analytically derive results. So there's a tension between 2 points of view. Either you make very realistic assumptions and resort to simulation. So
You and I are just talking, so. Or are people still listening? Okay.
Yeah, I can hear it.
Okay, fine. I just wasn't sure if it was
right.
just the two of us.
So I want to say that in some settings you can make very detailed, realistic models, but then resort to simulations because you cannot really prove, so your conclusions become a little suspect. Or you can make very simplified models, so your assumptions become a little suspect, but your conclusions are, and those are two different sort of, I would say, styles or modes of inquiry.
I'll use that in the introduction. I'm all the way on the other.